Hello and welcome to the first video on my channel. This is the royal book review. I'm going to be reviewing books about royals, obviously. I'm normally not really into the Windsors, they're a bit too modern for me, but they've really been bringing the drama the past few years. Historians will never have this much content from royals, ever. So I'm going to be discussing lots of different books, but today I'm going to focus on the beginning of 3 different books because they kind of all tie into this topic that I want to talk about, which is the reliability of royal books, biographies, anything written by someone else. I'm going to be looking at the beginning of Spare, by the Spare, who's not really required anymore, but the Spare. The Prince of Wales biography by Jonathan Dimbleby, and Finding Freedom by probably not a reputable source on royal information, but nonetheless, they wrote a royal book, so let's read it. There's definitely been a worrying trend the past couple of years. Information doesn't necessarily need to be true, it just needs to be believed by enough people to make it seem true. So first of all, Harry's book Spare, it's a first-hand account from an actual royal. It's a primary source and we should consider primary sources reliable. However, unfortunately, it isn't. We're going to analyse it and I'm going to tell you why I don't think it's a reliable source of information. Then I'm going to look at the Dimbleby biography from 1994 because I think that's a good example of something that has some reliability because it's well sourced, and it's also written by someone who isn't a royal writer. So they didn't approach the project of writing a book about a royal through the lens of being interested in the royals predominantly, like it's not really his niche. And then to juxtapose a reliable biography, I've added the beginning of Finding Freedom. I'm going to timestamp when I'm talking about which book, so you can just jump to that if you're interested in those bits. I'm going to start with Spare, and I'm going to try my best not to get sassy. It's a trauma response. I can't help it. When a man is trying to gaslight me, it just comes out. So if I start sounding like I've got a bit of an attitude. Full disclosure, I've read all 3 of these books at least twice. I've read Spare 3 times, which hence the sassy disclaimer, because I have a lot to say on that as well. Like, I feel like most people who have done reviews of that book, I feel like they didn't read it. Reading for enjoyment and reading to be analytical and to critique something, it's not the same. So obviously I read it with the intent of fact checking it and scrutinising what he wrote. I am fully aware to the extent which that really isn't an accurate and honest retelling of a lot of events. There's a line between talking about how something made you feel and you just not being able to process your emotions and choosing to deflect and project onto other people. Like, there's a difference. But anyway, so in the beginning of Spare, Harry takes us to April 2021 after the funeral of his grandfather, Prince Philip. Obviously this is a memoir and it's different to a biography in terms of the fact there's no sourcing, there's no reference list. So he's setting it up as though he's waiting for his father and his brother, who he's asked for a secret meeting with. He employs some literary devices, describing the scene. The weather was quintessentially April, he writes. Not quite winter, not yet spring. And he remarks that once upon a time this was going to be my forever home. Instead, it had been proven to just be another brief stop. I think the first thing that we need to look at is the intention behind the language being used. For instance, he says, when my wife and I fled this place in fear of our sanity and physical safety, I wasn't sure when I'd ever come back. That was January 2020. Now 15 months later, here I was, days after waking to 32 missed calls and then one short heart-racing talk with Granny. Harry, Grandpa's gone. So you can see the dramatic use of language. They fled this place for their physical safety, their sanity. It's using quite dramatic, melodramatic language, especially when you realise the reality is they had left the country 6 weeks prior to January 2020 to take their break. This was announced at the end of 2019 that they wouldn't be spending Christmas with the royals, and obviously, spoiler alert, later in the book he admits that they were using that time to plan what they were going to do next because they were unhappy with the situation in the institution. Yet he's making it seem quite hurried, like they had to just pack up and run and just take the things that they had with them, when it was a lot more planned than that. Try not to get sassy. So then he remarks upon all these memories of his grandfather because he wants you to feel that he's someone who cares about his family. So he says, I thought of Grandpa's strong opinions, his many passions, carriage driving, barbecuing, shooting, food, beer, the way he embraced life. He had that in common with my mother. Enter Diana. She is in every aspect of this book, and that's something that Harry uses to slip in for a lot of different reasons. But in this instance, it's because he has to remind the reader that, did you know my mum's Princess Diana? My mum, Princess Diana, who died tragically. I'm her son. And this is the beginning of where he starts to use a lot of speculative language. He uses a lot of speculation in his book, which is weird because he should know this. This is his life, and yet he uses speculative language. So of his grandfather and his mother, he says, some actually said he broke with my parents' marriage. Surely you'd know how your parents came to be married if you were living in the institution. You would know that. Either he doesn't know or he just doesn't want to tell the reader, which is weird because this has been marketed as some kind of truthful, raw, honest account. You know, the real him, not the prince he was born, the man he is now. But there's just a lot of speculative details. He's just kind of spreading rumours almost about his own life. And then he makes a really weird comment after he talks about Prince Philip brokering the marriage. He says, if so, an argument could be made that Grandpa was the prime cause in my world, but for him I wouldn't be here. So it's just, I think this is kind of like sowing the seeds of what the rest of the narrative is going to be like. It's almost passive-aggressively blaming Prince Philip for everything that happened. He's the one who allegedly brokered the marriage. Allegedly. Who knows? He then talks about his mother for a while, about how she's indescribable. I think there are a lot of words to describe Diana, aren't there? People routinely compared her to icons and saints, from Nelson Mandela to Mother Teresa to Joan of Arc, but even such comparisons, while lofty and loving, also felt wide off the mark. And that's the whole point of like an icon, is that they're not comparable. Duh. Yeah. I don't really have anything to say about his recollection of memories of his mother. They're his. Do with what you will. But the only thing I will comment on is that he's saying that he's basically thinking about his mother at this point in time when he's waiting in the gardens of Frogmore Cottage for his brother and his father. Then this is when I'm gonna find it. He says he was carrying his mother's flag in that garden in April. I'd come to those gardens because I wanted peace. I wanted it more than anything. I wanted it for my family's sake and for my own, but also for hers. For context, Harry does not mention, in this whole beginning bit, while he's waiting for his father and brother, after he'd fled and hasn't been back for months, he doesn't mention the fact that a few weeks ago he did a very explosive, highly publicised tell-all interview with Oprah Winfrey, in which he accused his family of being racist. I think that context is very important, and the fact that he doesn't mention it throughout the entire prologue is very telling of what kind of narrative he's trying to tell. The way he litters these little anecdotes about his mother in between the fact that he's misrepresenting the true context of these events. I'm just going to say it, he's quite emotionally manipulative. There's just no self-reflection. He's talking about wanting peace when he's the one who started throwing the grenades in the first place. He writes, for months the Windsors had been at war. There had been strife in our rank on and off going back centuries, but this was different. This was full-scale public rupture and it threatened to become irreparable. And who ruptured it? Who did that? Who decided to take a private family spat, whatever you want to call it, and bring it to the public? And not only to bring it to the public, but to sell it to the highest bidder and to monetize it. So when he's writing his anxiety of waiting for his father and brother, completely misrepresenting to his readers the true context of the events, hoping that, you know, whoever's reading this will be reading it sympathetically and just listening to what he has to say rather than acknowledging, you know, the facts. It's important to note as well, he says, so though I'd flown home specifically and solely for Grandpa's funeral, while there I'd asked for this secret meeting with my older brother Willie and my father to talk about the state of things. So if he didn't ask for this meeting, they wouldn't have spoken to him, basically. And this was another detail, I've got this in my notes, and it's the bit where he says, for half a second I considered giving up, going for a walk through the gardens by myself or heading back to the house where all my cousins were drinking and sharing stories of Grandpa. Wasn't it social distancing at this time? Why were they all drinking in the same room? Not another partygate. Then, at last, I saw them. Shoulder to shoulder, striding towards me, they looked grim, almost menacing. More, they looked tightly aligned. My stomach dropped. Normally they'd be squabbling about one thing or another, but now they appeared to be in lockstep, in league. I think this was a very interesting passage. Indicates a lot of things, and I suppose this has been speculated on in the press for a long time, that William and Charles have quite a difficult relationship, and that they've been at odds a lot throughout the years. But I think it's also very important to notice that not once has either one of them ever publicly talked about this. That's between them. Regardless of people talking, regardless of staff members or one of their friends talking, they haven't. And I think that's kind of the point. And I think it's also important to look at how Harry is uncomfortable with the fact that his father and brother, who normally have a more challenging relationship, are united on this, and united he sees against him. And he says the thought occurred, hang on, are we meeting for a walk or a duel? He's very defensive in this prologue. He's almost trying to present it as though they're attacking him, they're ganging up on him. Completely, again, ignoring the fact he'd just done an interview with Oprah. He's the one who lobbied all of these allegations without any proof, but he's the one who started this, and now he feels ganged up on because they're defensive and they're united on this. So, and this is where he's quite manipulative, because he's presenting it as though this is confrontational, but he's the one who started the confrontation in the first place. He's the one who's the confrontational aspect of this, not William and Charles in this instance, because they would be looking grim, wouldn't they? How do they know that he's not going to go and do another interview and talk about their conversation? That's a valid feeling when someone's betrayed your trust like that. Because again, William and Charles, neither of them have ever gone on the record to discuss their relationship with each other in a negative way. So then again, to talk about his anxiety, he brings up the feelings of walking behind my mother's coffin, going into battle for the first time, giving a speech at the middle of a panic attack. He wants his reader to empathise with him and feel that he's in a very troubled position. I was saying as well that Harry's audience for his book is obviously American, because he writes, being British, being Windsor, we began chatting casually about the weather. You know, he has to play up this stereotype of British, stiff upper lip nonsense to his American readers, because that's who he wants to buy his book, really. Because that's where he's setting up his new life, and they're his new demographic that he needs to appeal to. So naturally, it would be quite awkward. What do you say to someone in that situation? That's a very normal response, to just have some small talk. Because what would you say? So finally, they get down to the nitty gritty of the point of this secret meeting, which is telling us all about. Secret. I tried to explain my side of things. I wasn't at my best. For starters, I was still nervous, fighting to keep my emotions in check. So he says Pat and Willie had their parts to play, and they'd come ready for a fight. Every time I ventured a new explanation, started a new line of thought, one or both of them would cut me off. Willie in particular didn't want to hear anything. After he'd shut me down several times, he and I began sniping, saying some of the same things we'd said for months. Years. It got so heated that Pa raised his hands. Enough. So let's analyse that little passage. First of all, he says that Charles and William are the ones who came for a fight. Again, to reiterate, he is the one who sold their family private business as literally that. A new business venture for him to monetise, to make money with. He can say, I didn't get paid for the Oprah interview, all he likes, but he got paid for this book, didn't he? And there would be no interest in this book without all this promotion and build-up, would there? So he admits that he had some explaining to do, but he's not talking about what he had explaining to do for. For instance, why did you talk to Oprah? Why did you do this interview? I thought you wanted to limit the press interest in your private life, yet here you are giving your private life a massive platform. So again, the way he summarises it without giving any indication of what was actually said is something that inhibits the reliability of it, because we're expected to take Harry's version as gospel, because he says William in particular didn't want to hear anything. What didn't he want to hear? What did you say that he didn't want to hear, that he reacted badly to? But he doesn't say. This is one of the big conclusions I drew from his book, is that he very much resents William. He's also incredibly jealous of him and his position, and as we go through the rest of Spare, I'll discuss those parts. But it's the fact that he says that they were saying things that they'd said for months, years. So this is all like boiling over, basically. William has every right to be angry with him. So then just some observations on Charles. So Charles stood between them, looking up at our flushed faces. Please, boys, don't make my final year's misery. Sorry, Charles. His voice sounded raspy, fragile. It sounded, if I'm being honest, old. Yeah, because Charles is elderly. I looked at Willie, really looked at him, maybe for the first time since we were boys. I took it all in, his familiar scowl, which had always been his default in dealings with me. His alarming baldness, more advanced than my own. His famous resemblance to Mummy, which was fading with time, with age. This might be really difficult for Harry to hear because he resents William so much. but he still looks like Diana. Even now, even bald, even older than she was when she died. He still looks like her. And do you know who looks like William? Princess Charlotte. And this is so funny. So because he's just got a little bit of hair at the front of his head, he thinks he's like, he's got something over William. Yes, he's more bald than me. Thank God. I've got something in this life. More hair. Hold on to that. In some ways he was my mirror. In some ways he was my opposite. My beloved brother. My arch nemesis. How would that happen? How would that happen? Well, it generally happens when you don't resolve any of your issues through therapy. Then again, I also found this quite literary in terms of the tropes, because it's kind of like he's making William look like a villain. Typical fairy tales, imaginings and things like that. The villain is always less attractive than the hero. As the reader, you root for the hero. I felt massively tired. I wanted to go home, and I realised what a complicated concept home had become. Or maybe always was. I gestured at the gardens, the city beyond, the nation, and said, Willie, this was supposed to be our home. We were going to live here the rest of our lives. Were they? And again, context. You know, we've all seen the Oprah interview. We've all seen the little inconsistencies with the timeline. There's a point in the Oprah interview where they're defending how their Megxit statement came out, how it was not blindsiding the Queen. And Harry says how he'd been talking to people at the institution for 2 years before it happened. 2 years before January 2020 with January 2018, which is before they got married. So how can you have been planning to spend the rest of your life somewhere if you were always planning on finding a way out the back door? But again, this is just how he feels. He feels in this moment that he was supposed to spend the rest of their lives there. So that must be how he feels. So William, apparently, who knows, William allegedly says, you left Harold. And then he replies, yeah, and you know why. William says, I don't. He honestly doesn't know why they left. And Harry couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was one thing to disagree about who was at fault or how things might have been different, but for him to claim total ignorance of the reason I'd fled the land of my birth, the land for which I'd fought and been ready to die, my mother country, that fraught phrase, to claim no knowledge of why my wife and I took the drastic step of picking up our child and just running like hell, leaving behind everything, house, friends, furniture. Really? Disagreement about fault, and this is the big theme in the whole of Spare, is that the fault is not Harry's, ever. No matter what happened, no matter what he chose to do, it's not his fault. And a lot of the times he finds a way to make it William's fault. Again, going back onto the resentment and jealousy there. It's been quite melodramatic. They took the drastic step of picking up their child and just running. They didn't just run, they had an announced break from royal duties for about 6 weeks, wasn't it? They weren't spending Christmas at Sandringham with the royals. They were going to do it privately and have some time off and then come back in the new year. But they weren't coming back in the new year. They were planning to skip it. The only difference is why it ended badly was because the Queen sacked them, and she was like, if you want to go, you can go, mate. That's fine. If that's going to make you happy, you can go. Both Charles and William are united on this. They don't understand why everything just went south so quickly. Again, having read the whole book, it's easy to see why they didn't see this coming, because Harry complains a lot about the same things over and over again. So at the end of the prologue he goes, the thoughts made me colder and terribly alone, but it also fired me up. I thought, I have to tell them. How can I tell them? I can't, it would take too long. Besides, they're clearly not in the right frame of mind to listen. I think listening is a very important skill, and is something that Harry doesn't really do well at. Yeah, he's not a very good listener, and I think that's something that even from this beginning passage, it just shows how much he just lacks empathy for other people, and he lacks reflection. The fact that he can't understand why his father and his brother would be, first of all, united against him when he's the one who has publicly criticised them and basically attacked them, which he doesn't mention in the prologue. I'm just telling you that now. He doesn't mention that at all in the beginning prologue part. So to recap the ending of the prologue, he says, besides, they're clearly not in the right frame of mind to listen. Not now, anyway. Not today. And so, part Willie, world, here you go. So that brings up a question, who is this book written for? Why is this book being written at all? Who is he talking to? Which is obviously, he wants his father and brother to know all this stuff as well. But more importantly, the world. Because why wouldn't you want the whole world to know your personal business? So again, just some brief points. This meeting was after the Oprah interview. where he made hefty accusations with not a single shred of evidence needed to be provided. He just had a space to talk and just persuade the audience watching that he's a victim of these circumstances. So trying to gaslight William and Charles and the reader to an extent into believing that they're being unreasonable and then being defensive. And this is where the lack of empathy comes in. The fact that he can't understand how someone else would feel because he'd done something to betray their trust like that. He can't understand why they would be angry with him. It's actually quite mind-blowing how someone can just lack that much self-awareness. So, and the big main point as well is that he's a victim. He had to flee. He fled. They picked up their kid and they ran, leaving all their furniture behind, completely ignoring the fact that they've been staying in these multi-million-pound mansions the whole time. Through friends, because you know everyone's got a big massive mansion. They're just 2 phone calls away from staying in a mansion for free. He doesn't mention the fact that the reason he hadn't come back was because of lockdowns. I'm pretty sure that if the pandemic didn't happen, him and Meghan would have been a lot more public. You know, if you think back to 2020, they were doing a lot of, you know, these Zoom meetings, and how much more public would they have been? How many more events would they have gone to? How much more would their little business venture have had a bit of a step up if they could actually go out and promote it themselves? Harry withholds very important details from the reader, and that's right from the prologue. He does this. Why is he leaving out all of these details? What do the details change about the story that he's trying to tell us? It changes a lot. The fact that he's trying to remember all the fond things about his grandfather, completely ignoring the fact that his grandfather was in hospital at the time that they did this interview. I mean, did the Queen at this point in time really need all of her staff having to be focused on a potential pushback and a statement about him when she's got the rest of her constitutional duties to be getting on with, and there are a lot of other things that she needs to be dealing with? Did she really need that at that point in time? And it's just something that seriously doesn't seem to have occurred to him at all. When I talk about the fact that he seems to lack empathy, it's things like that. It just hasn't even occurred to him. Even though this is a first-hand account, it is quite unreliable simply for the fact that he's choosing to leave out certain details. Either he's choosing to leave them out, or he's just really that self-absorbed and that other people's feelings just don't occur to him at all. Which, either one, it's only one of those 2 options, and they're both not particularly great, are they? Because of the way it's written as well, it's how he feels. So there's no sourcing, there's no actual referencing. It's just how he feels about things, and what he feels he wants to share. It really does limit how reliable you can take it, because as I've just shown, he just leaves out a lot of detail. Not a great source of information if you have to constantly look something up to make sure that it matches up with what happened at the time. So now we're going to move on to the Dimbleby biography and the introduction of that. So the Dimbleby book was brought up a lot, especially as a deflection from criticism of Harry's book, saying, oh well, Charles spoke out and did a book, so why can't Harry? And this is the counter argument to that. So the book was written by Jonathan Dimbleby. Now, who is Jonathan Dimbleby? He is a nepo baby. His father was Richard Dimbleby, and he was a journalist and broadcaster, and he was actually the first war correspondent for the BBC. His older brother is also in the industry, David Dimbleby, and he was a presenter on Question Time, which is a panel show on BBC. So when Dimbleby wrote this book, he'd been working in the industry for about 25 years or so. He's not trying to make a name for himself by doing this explosive book, and this was also a documentary he produced about it, Charles was about the time. So he's not trying to make a name for himself. He's not trying to be intentionally sensational or explosive. He's actually trying to document a certain point in history. For the context as well, 2 years previously, Diana's authorised biography by Andrew Morton came out, and that was a very explosive and sensational book. So this book coincided with the 25th anniversary of the investiture of the Prince of Wales. So I'm going to read some snippets of the introduction. With the monarchy itself under sceptical review, it seemed to me likely that the occasion would trigger an appraisal of the heir of the throne, which would be unrelenting if not so merciless as the scrutiny of his private life essayed by the tabloid media. This is obviously more well written than Harry's book, because this is by someone who's actually, despite being a nepo baby, actually had to work at being a journalist and writing skills. So that's Dimbleby's way of saying that Charles's private life is in the tabloids a lot, which we knew. The context for which the book is written is basically documenting a certain period of time for an important person in history. Dimbleby admits it would have been impossible to embark on such a project without a degree of cooperation from the Prince himself, To write a book based on hearsay, gossip and yellowing cuttings would have been to contribute to a familiar genre. A bit of a meow comment there about tabloid press. He's admitting that Charles cooperated with his biography and the process of writing it. This is something that Charles has been upfront about, which shows that it's distinguishing itself from the tabloid press. This isn't about setting the record straight as well, or persuading people to believe a certain narrative. It's about establishing a factual sense of a particular time about a particular important figure in history. So Dimbleby had access for 2 years to archives at St James's Palace, as well as Windsor Castle, and Charles's personal childhood diaries and letters. In this book, he has direct quotes from those sources of information. And Dimbleby also notes that the prince has not discouraged past and present members of the royal household from speaking to him. Some of his friends and some of his relatives have talked about him openly and at length, almost all of them for the first time. It's not just his friends giving like a nice glowing review, it's also people from the royal household. So that kind of access is unprecedented, especially for someone who's currently living. They normally wait till after they've died before that much access is given, or before someone's going to talk about someone that much. To protect the privacy of their relationships with the prince, I have generally refrained from attributing opinions and feelings to particular individuals. I have identified the names of almost all of my sources in the acknowledgements. That's a little mystery. If you want to do that, you can kind of guess who might have said what particular thing, but I think that's important to note that that's just for opinions and feelings for individuals, not factual piece of information, which shouldn't really trigger a kind of emotional response, shall we say. So there are ethical implications which Dimbleby has accounted for in his biography. Privacy being a big ethical issue. Dimbleby also notes that the interviews are untaped and stored in the Prince's archives for future historians to peruse. One day maybe we'll get to have a look at some of those archives if we live that long. It does confront the contemporary issue of the day, which is the broken marriage of the Waleses. This book was published in 1994. John Major announced the legal separation in December 1992. So after their separation, which was announced when this book was already in progress, important detail there, it became impossible to ignore the circumstances which led up to that sad but very public moment. So the biggest story in Charles's life was not his work life, it was his marriage. It has already been widely averred in the tabloid media that the prince was almost solely responsible for the evidently unhappy state of his marriage. Charles is being attacked in the press. We don't know what's happened, obviously, from the Morton biography. Some details got out, but again, that's another story. Charles was public enemy number 1 at this time, and Diana was leading a very successful campaign against him. His suitability to inherit the crown had become a matter of public debate, which is really the kind of crucial role when we're talking about intentions and motivations, and why that argument of Harry and Charles, like, oh, Charles wrote a book too, he did a biography as well. It's different. Harry is not on the path to being head of state, is he? It's a very different thing to criticise someone who is, well, a spare, surplus to requirement now, and someone who is actually going to occupy a very important role in society. That person has to be on moral and ethical reproach, and this was really affecting that because people were debating about whether or not he was suitable, which is a big deal. No far-minded and compassionate reader would seek to attribute blame to either prince or the princess for what went wrong, that they both hoped to preserve it from collapse, and sadly that perhaps is the most remarkable feature, that it survived for as long as it did. So Dimbleby's offering a fair assessment of the situation. He's not taking a side, he's not assigning blame. A no-fault divorce, if you shall. Which is ironic because hardcore Dianaists, whatever you want to call them, are very invested in this false narrative that she's just this princess locked in a tower and all this stuff just happened to her. So Dimbleby also paraphrases or withholds sensitive information that could jeopardise British diplomacy, i.e. letters from government ministers, the monarch, Westminster, Whitehall, which is important again because I feel like that gets lost in translation because a lot of people are more interested in the sensational aspects of the royals as opposed to the fact that, you know, there is a quite a diplomatic function that they serve. Charles as well, at this time being Prince of Wales. Dimbleby writes, this bit's funny. However, when it was obvious that only the culture of secrecy which pervades Whitehall was under threat, and not the conduct of good governance, I have not compiled with a request to delete pertinent material. So he basically saying that there's a difference between sensitive government correspondence and people in the government being held to a standard of practice. They can't use if it makes a certain minister or someone look bad, and it's not about government or governing or compliance and things like that. This is why I think I have less sympathy for Harry as I read more information, because Really, there were so many people in the government throughout Charles's life who thought they had a right to decide where he went to school, what he did with his life, who his friends were. And that just did not happen to either William or Harry, where there are people in the government have been this involved in what they could and could not do with their personal lives. They just didn't experience that. While I have corrected factual errors, I have not been inhibited from writing what I feel to be the truth about him. So Dimbleby, he's giving his opinion. He's giving an honest opinion as someone who has done a lot of research and had access to a lot of information about this person. He's not going to sugarcoat it. So it wasn't a hit piece and it wasn't sycophantic either. To me, it seems like it's something that's trying to restore neutrality in a very toxic media culture. And I think this is something that I got from it. Charles is kind of a nerd. He likes his history, he likes his archives. I think he's someone who's very aware from a very young age that he is a significant person and that even his childhood diaries are going to be interesting one day. He's marking the occasion of his 25th anniversary of his investiture. And it also makes the point that all these letters that are in this book that have been referenced, they're all going to be made public one day. And it makes you think about all the other things that have happened since. You know, like certain letters that someone in Montecito keeps writing to him. They will one day become public, which is very interesting. I wonder how kindly history will look upon that. So again, it's not a sensational book, the Dimbleby biography. It's more based on a factual assessment of certain events, and it's written by someone who has credibility and professional duty. Again, to bring it up, he's obviously made some ethical steps to make sure that he's protected his sources, for instance, which cannot be said for Spare. And then to juxtapose a good and ethical biography, I'm going to talk about one that it's not unethical, it's just that it's kind of hypocritical. And that's Finding Freedom by Scobie and Caroline Durand. It was a very big deal coming out a few years ago. We're talking about the source of these royal books and who is writing them. So let's look at who Scobie is. He wrote for Us Weekly, which is a tabloid, a fluffy, speculative, rumour-driven tabloid that probably makes its bread and butter by having very cosy relationships with a lot of celebrities' PR firms. I think the main difference is the style of writing. It's very fluffy. It's like a chick lit book, really. It's more about trying to humanise these characters, and they are characters in this book because they really aren't like a well-rounded view of someone. It's the character that they're writing. They're selling a love story, basically. And it takes a lot of cues from other royal biographies that capitalise on the tabloid culture, and it is like a piece of literature as opposed to an actual like non-fiction book. And I suppose in a lot of ways that can make something more readable because not everyone fancies reading like a big information book and checking the references in the back, do they? So just an example, in the beginning of Finding Freedom they recount being at Kensington Palace when they announced the engagement, and he says, "She looked over at a nervous Harry, put her hand on his back, rubbing the same spot several times. 'You've got this,' she whispered to the prince." It's just very fluffy. So there's just like a rose tintedness about it. So immediately he's putting the protagonists, because they are protagonists, they're not people, on a pedestal. It's very sycophantic in the way that it's not just highlighting their good traits, he has to make their good traits seem unique and special to just them. And it's this thing where they seem to need to elevate them to above the rest of us mere mortals. And I find it very... I'm not going to talk about what William and Kate book right now, but I'm just saying, just for a comparison, with them it's very much like their PR or branding or their canon. It seems to be that they're just two very normal people who met at university in exceptional circumstances. Whereas in Finding Freedom, the whole premise is that Harry and Meghan are just more special than everyone else. Their love is more special than everyone else's love. It's a love story, it's not a relationship. He was used to being in front of the press, but this time was different. He wasn't advocating for one of his charities or urging leaders to take climate change seriously. He was sharing something personal, the news of his engagement to Meghan. So again, he's like slotting up all the things of why he's so much better than just normal people. Advocating for charities, urging world leaders to take climate change seriously. Got to cash in the Diana currency. They walked out of the small gate at the side of Kensington Palace and up the long canopied path to the sunken garden whose lily-covered water in its ornamental pond and colourful pansies, tulips, blooming heck. So it's one of Princess Diana's favourite spots on the estate she once called home. Again, when I said the fluffy, flowery language, I was being literal. This was the couple's big engagement photo call at which I'd arrived with only minutes to spare after a frantic highway dash from a long weekend break in Oxfordshire. So this is what I think is the most interesting thing, especially the introduction. is like the self-insertion of the writer. Like the protagonist of his book, Megan, he somehow finds a way to make all these details about him. Do we really need to know that he had a long weekend break in Oxfordshire? No. Soho farmhouse perhaps? Carolyn ahead of me was already in her place with a small huddle of royal correspondents who worked directly with the royal households on a daily basis. And this is the thing that I got from this introduction, was that Omid is piggybacking on Carolyn's experience in the industry. This is just my opinion, again, just my opinion, but I feel like she's how he got the book deal in the first place, because he wrote for Us Weekly. And full offence, it's not like he was writing, you know, like Tolstoy, is it? It's Us Weekly. He's not writing these great pieces of journalism. It's just fluffy tabloid stuff. And he just got this big book deal out of nowhere. And it's because of Carolyn, let's be real. There are a lot of questionable things in terms of motivations about this book and this particular writer as well. Because Omid Scobie's made the past few years part of his agenda to cast suspicion on royal reporters and their practice and their relationship with the palace. One example is, you know, him trying to make briefing seem suspicious when that's a very normal thing to do, that a journalist will go and talk to the palace comms team, ask them about something. If they want to give a comment, they will. If they don't, they don't. Or if something's going to be happening, they'll be like, oh, look out for this is coming this day. This is a very normal part of like freedom of the press, democracy. We need transparency, especially with an institution like the monarchy. It would be weird if the household didn't speak to the press. So he's writing like he is part of, you know, the royal reporter pack. Yet he's spent so much time and effort to try and cast suspicion on being a royal reporter. But not him, guys. He's special. He's not like the other ones. And here's an example of what I mean. So he writes, as a long-time members of this group, she and I receive intel as we shadow senior members of the British royal family at home and abroad. So with him, it's not suspicious. If he gets intel, if he gets briefed information, it's not suspicious. It's not something that has been done in bad faith. It's very normal. But with other members of the royal family, with other reporters, apparently it's like, oh, invisible contract again. That's how journalism works. The privilege of covering the royals so closely is that you are front and centre for those landmark moments in their lives. This might be an unpopular opinion, but it's just my opinion. I feel like if you are a journalist, a reporter, whatever you want to call yourself, and you only write about the young royals, like with Omid, he only wrote about William and Catherine and Harry, you're not a royal reporter. You're a pop culture writer. Because if you were a royal reporter, you'd be writing about royal stuff. And he just doesn't have that knowledge at all. Because he's a pop culture writer, he writes about tabloid stuff because he wrote for Us Weekly. So he wrote, when we were on the steps of the Lindo wing when George, Charlotte and Louis each were born, it's easy to take for granted these moments which will one day be part of history. Carolyn and I, again, have followed the work of the royal family since long before Meghan joined what is known as the firm. Has he followed the work of the royal family, or has he followed the young relevant royals? For years we have travelled with William, Kate and Harry around the world. Bingo. Where was he on Charles and Camilla's tours? You know, the heir to the throne. Has he done anything with the Queen? So then he lists like some of the places they've been. We shared the same plane and Disney itineraries as these young royals. Young royals, not the royals, because at this time the Queen was the royal, because she was the Queen. This is just like an ick that I have, but I find it really jarring when British people speak in Americanisms or use American spelling for things. And I'm like, but you're British. I think the main reason this book is written like this is because it's been sold in America. Like Harry's book, it's for Americans. They don't care about Britain, even though it's the British royal family. Omid finds a way to self-insert into this narrative, how he plays a role in the story and why his voice is reliable. So he writes, take the time I lost my passport in Sao Paulo, Brazil. I was frantically searching my bag at the airport when I got a call from one of the palace aides. I could hear Iris' instinctive laugh in the background. They had found my passport on the floor. Not wanting to leave me high and dry in Brazil, the prince sent over one of his protection officers, passport in hand, to my terminal so I could get to Chile on time. The next time I saw Harry, however, he forewent my name, instead of calling me passport. As we Brits say, he likes to take the mickey. Oh my god. See, it's because of the Americanisms. It sounds like someone writing what they think a British person sounds like. But it's not. Going back to that earlier point where I mentioned that Omid has made it part of his branding and his agenda to cast suspicion on royal reporters speaking to the members of the royal family, their team, briefings. He writes, on that same trip, Harry confessed to me at a small drinks gathering at our hotel that he really wished he were just a normal guy who could pack up and spend a year in Brazil, pursuing his own passions. He said he hated smartphones being constantly thrust in his face, that the thrill of professional camera shutters going off sometimes made him feel physically ill. That's a very personal admission to have with someone that you don't really like or know, because they've made a big deal about, haven't they, that Harry doesn't like journalists or the press, yet he's there being very chummy with them. It's a very intimate conversation, and it's another example of just a bit of hypocrisy. So he's undermining and discredits like other people's work because it's critical of Harry and Meghan. So we're all having a conversation with them, so whining and dining them for better press coverage. But he's doing the same thing. You speak to them because you're on the tour with them. Carolyn and I, again, Harry got his book deal, always knew Harry dreamed of a life away from palace walls, but while travelling with the prince, particularly in the countryside, we noticed that his wish to be connected to the everyday rural life was often accompanied by a sense of sadness. Although an impossibility, he wished to connect with the locals without the fuss his arrival always meant. In hindsight, there is literally nothing stopping him from volunteering in his local communities. Hush hush, we don't have to know anything about it. Maybe he's doing it right now, who knows. Imagery and this sense of being trapped within the institution is this is what their narrative relies upon. Is it true? How true is it? It's like 4 years now from exit, and how often does he pop into the local community with no fuss? Harry deeply craves normalcy of the kind that his mother Diana tried to replicate for him on trips to amusement parks and McDonald's. How funny to know that the favourite part of a Happy Meal for this child, born of unimaginable wealth and privilege, was getting the cheap plastic toy inside. So he's trying to add some sentimental information to make Harry seem, more human and relatable. Every child who went to McDonald's wants the toy in the Happy Meal. That's not a unique little quirk. That's the whole point of a Happy Meal, because you got the toy. Harry is different from his brother William, who takes after their orderly and pragmatic granny, the Queen. He's emotional and clings to utopian ideas, yet in his way, admirably so. Is it admirably so that you're delusional? And I think that just sets it up how Finding Freedom goes, is that it doesn't matter how ridiculous or irrational Harry and Meghan are at certain times. The writer of this book does not want to acknowledge that. In fact, it's admirable that he lives in this utopian world and is too emotional to deal with real things and he's not pragmatic. It's admirable that he can't accept reality and just deal with things in a pragmatic way. This bit made me laugh. His desire to live outside the palace bubble in everything from being a hugger at official engagements to insisting he serve on the front lines of war as a member of the armed forces. So, first of all, this is something that I'm sure will trigger some people. If you apply for a combat role in the armed forces, you have a combat role in the armed forces. Insistence or reluctance is inconsequential. That's the role he applied to do. He's not insisting, he applied to do that job. It's like saying a school teacher insisting on working in the classroom with the children. It's like that's the job that he signed up to do. So that is a trend that appears in Finding Freedom and in Harry's own books there. He likes to be praised for doing what's expected or the bare minimum. Oh, he was nice to people when he met them at this engagement. It's like, you being nice to people that you've just met is kind of the bare minimum. So I would say it's a positive attribute, even at times it causes problems for the rest of the royal family. And this is like part of the narrative that they have in Finding Freedom that Omid has, that it's, I'm going to say Omid because how much did Karen really write this book? So he's a problem because he's so good, he's so nice, he's just some normal guy, he's just like you, he just wants the plastic toy. Why would that cause a problem for anyone else? It doesn't. There's a definite agenda here to try and make it seem like Harry, who is constitutionally irrelevant really, is a threat to the system and like the system had to try and control him. That's the narrative. And I think it's quite an ironic statement as well about the royal bubble, because in hindsight, that we have the benefit of now, it seems like he does miss the royal bubble a lot. That's why a few years ago when they were filming their Netflix reality show, they were doing all their pseudo royal engagements for content, because he wants that image back. He wants people to see him as an important person. His wholeheartedness allowed him to start a new chapter in royal history when he fell in love with Meghan Markle. Here we go, it's going to get really flowery now. Being a mixed race Brit was one of the reasons that I Like a lot of the younger and more diverse demo of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex turned into royal watching, we found the American actress married into the House of Windsor so fascinating. Younger and more diverse demo. Okay, first of all, Omid's like 40 odd. And I'm saying that with the arrogance of someone who is almost 30. Younger demo. He said demo, not demographic, because he's so down with kids. He's a younger demo. He doesn't need to use the whole word. I find this whole narrative, which is something that Harry and Meghan have used too. This idea that because Meghan is just, she has one black parent, that she's somehow changing history. And I mean, it is significant, but it's like there's limits to how significant it is, really. And the word tokenism comes to mind a lot. And when I read statements like this, the reason that they're interested is because she's mixed race. It's just very, I don't know, it just doesn't sit right with me. It makes me quite uncomfortable. I think it makes me more uncomfortable with the fact that it's people, it's coming from groups that, this tokenism is coming from groups that are presenting themselves as awake to certain social issues. And it's quite problematic to say that tokenism is like a good thing, because it's not. This is something that gets on my nerves, is that being mixed race is very different from being mixed race and being black. So Omid's trying to make out like he understands me and my perspective of the world. I find it quite jarring, because yeah, you're mixed race and you have dual heritage upbringing, but you don't know what it's like to have a black parent and be black and be part of those kind of cultural conversations. That's something that he's trying to give himself an authority, because he's also mixed race, but you're not mixed race like me, so you don't have that perspective. So again, let's just cut that right there. So he doesn't have that experience to talk about these issues. So that bit where he wrote, he found the American actress married to the House of Windsor fascinating. He calls her American actress, which is important, because that's how Meghan was viewed. She was viewed as an American actress. It wasn't her race that was the first thing that's being identified about her. When you look at her, you don't think black, you think American actress. So her race is literally down the list on things that will affect her in society because of how she looks. And it's not just about the fact that she's mixed race and she already has a privilege over people who have like two black parents, for instance, but it's how she's positioned herself in the world as well. And she's made specific choices to present herself a certain way. But that's a conversation for another time. So then he goes on, funnily enough, I met Meghan before Harry did. Back in 2015, I chatted with her for the first time at a Fashion Week event in Toronto, after she did press interviews on the carpet. No one was more amazed than me when just a year later, Meg, as her close friends, and now husband call her, captured the heart of the most eligible bachelor this side of the pond. I didn't know long-term royal reporters covered press interviews at Toronto Fashion Week. The world watched in amazement as the couple's relationship rapidly developed. This hyperbolic language is not just isolated in Omid's book, it's generally in Harry and Meghan. They both like to use this. The world was watching us. The world watched. The world was obsessed. Everyone is, obviously. They speak as though they're the centre of the universe. Most people do not care or are invested in the royal family like that. I certainly haven't been. I didn't grow up like obsessed with them. I mean, I'll have the bank holidays, because I remember when William and Catherine got married, we had like 2 extra bank holidays, wasn't it? And I was like revising for my A-levels at the time, so I had like an extra day of college. I'll have the bank holiday. Like, most people don't really care. So these hyperbolic statements of like the world watched in amazement, it's like most people don't care. Most people are not that invested. Carolyn and I watched too, as a number of tabloids went on to accuse Meghan of being a demanding and difficult social climber. Some of the British press did little to hide racial undertones in snarky commentary and headlines. To briefly address this statement, again, I've read Spare, and in Harry's version of events, he confirms a lot of these press stories about her being a difficult boss. He's just annoyed that they were made public, and that's what he's using as they were briefed against them by these men in grey suits. So one instance is she did send out a lot of emails in unsocial hours. There's also a bit where he praises Meghan for sharing freebies, and then he says that a member of staff was forced to resign because she was getting freebies, even though Meghan was giving them all freebies because she's such a nice boss. Tabloids having snarky headlines is not something that is isolated to these two people. That's just how it works. If you want to talk about snarky tabloid headlines, why don't you go back about 12 years and have a look at how they spoke about the Middletons if you want to talk about snarky headlines. The narrative that emerged was most surprising to Meghan, who brought her charitable interests and official engagements as the newest member of the royal family. The same go-and-get-'em approach she's taken from the time she was 11, writing letters of protest to national leaders, including Hillary Clinton, over sex is so bad. We're never going to not hear about that, are we? It's not unknown for her to stay up late into the night before events, doing her own research and preparing her own notes despite having a staff for such work. Hindsight that. After she complained to Oprah that she had to stay up late at night learning the national anthem. And if I'm being super critical, why would she stay up late at night if you're managing your time of the day properly? Because that was her job, to be royal. You shouldn't need to stay up late to prepare if you had been doing a job in the day, which was preparing for your royal duties. It's the little details like this where they try and make her seem special and more unique or more hardworking than the others, where they're trying to set up this narrative that, oh, because she did this, it made them feel a type of way. When it's like, why are you staying up late if that's your day job? It's not like it's a side hustle. This is your literal job now that you've signed up to do. You shouldn't need to stay up late. How much research could possibly go into it that you're having to prepare that much? So Omi has claimed that he didn't speak to Harry and Meghan regarding this book. Yet he writes, "It's the only way I know how to do it." She confessed to him. How could she confess something to him if she hadn't spoken to him? Or is he just using this anecdotal information? That's part of what made the prince declare he'd found the teammate he'd always been looking for. Again, hindsight. After reading Spare, it seemed Harry wanted more than just a teammate. He wanted a winning teammate because he wanted to beat William and Catherine. So Caroline and I had been with Meghan for her final engagements, but it was still hard to believe this would be the last one. And I think this is where it gets quite dramatic because, full offence, it was like not even 2 years. Staff who had been with the couple from day one were mourning the end of what was supposed to be a happy story. Like, that's not a long time in most people's corporate jobs, is it? A couple of years out, mourning, because it's such a loss, they're mourning. It's two people fall in love, get married, have a baby, serve the Queen, the end. Instead, they were leaving the country. First of all, they had a very high turnover for staff, so how many people were actually there from day one, literally? And it's just melodramatic for no reason. Like, it's not really a sad story, like... And I feel like this is the whole point of why a lot of this stuff is being blown out of proportion and why it needs to be sensationalised by the tabloids, because they're kind of irrelevant. Like, it'd be different if this was William and Catherine who were like, we don't want the royal life anymore, because he's literally, like, right now he's the heir to the throne, he's next in line. But it's just not significant like that. The only thing that's significant about these things is the fact that they're just so messy about it and they're kind of selling out their families. So, to reiterate, Omid says he hasn't talked to Meghan, but he has hugged her. As Meghan gave me a final hug goodbye, she said, "It didn't have to be this way." Again, this is a very emotional statement to make for someone that you're not familiar with, but again, she's a hugger, she hugs everyone. I guess Caroline and I witnessed the many private and public struggles Harry and Meghan went through in the first 2 years of their marriage. Still, this was not the ending to the book that either of us expected to write, or that the couple had expected to be living. But it's just the fact that they're making it quite melodramatic and seem like it's just not comparable. Again, like when you're trying to compare it to like Diana, she was married to Charles for a very long time. Come on, that's a long time to be unhappy in your life. So he writes, as a rule, no member of the British royal family is officially allowed to authorise a biography. Bollocks. Bollocks. So many members of the royal family have authorised biographies. The most recent one has been the Duke of Kent, Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent. He's got an authorised biography out right now. But let's go on to some more visible members of the royal family. Princess Royal has an authorised biography by Brian Hoey. Princess Anne's literally written one, a book about herself, riding through my life. It's probably about horses, but she's still written a book. Princess Margaret has an authorised biography by Christopher Warwick. That was when she was still alive. And obviously Charles's book. But again, I suppose the thing that we need to look at is when we're talking about as a rule, is because this isn't a biography, this is a longer version of a tabloid basically, because it is being sensational, it's been literary, it's been overly romantic because we're all supposed to romanticise a relationship of strangers. It's like small details like this where he says stuff like that, and it's kind of how much knowledge about the royals you actually know. If you know, a quick Google search could show you a list of members of the royal family who have authorised biographies when they were alive. So if he was actually like a royal reporter, he would have an ounce of royal knowledge beyond what Duchess Kate was wearing, eating, or where she's gone on holiday again. because that's literally all of his articles for Us Weekly. Duchess Kate doing this or that. Before his mixed race token colonial princess came along. Duchess Kate. That's a very critical point that I have about this book. It's a royal book written by someone who has very limited royal knowledge generally. He's as much a royal expert as I'm a football pundit, and the only thing I can tell you about football is anything I learned from that Colin Rooney documentary. It's been sold as having exclusive access. He writes, Carolyn and I were able to gain extensive access to those closest to the couple, friends, trusted aides, senior courtiers, and many individuals in the Sussex's inner circle. So even though they're spreading gossip, their gossip is more reliable than other people's gossip, basically. We also accompanied Harry and Meghan on hundreds of engagements, work trips and tours, spanning from Ireland to Tonga, all in an effort to create an intimate and accurate portrait of a truly modern royal couple who, whether their decisions have won them praise or criticism, have always remained faithful to their own beliefs. So only they're using the royal we. Doesn't just apply to his own journalism, where he's trying to piggyback on Carolyn's career to make it seem like we've done all this stuff, haven't we, Carolyn? He's beefed up Meghan's CV too. Hundreds of engagements. I always see that figure. She did like 72 days work as a royal. That's not hundreds. So some points about this book and why this source of information is something that you need to scrutinise. Omid's not a royal reporter, he's a pop culture tabloid writer, and he's just specialised now into royal stuff because it's popular at the moment, and that he's only really covered the younger royals, and it explains why there's so many inaccuracies even in the introduction. Like the small thing about people don't authorise a biography. They have, it's just that there's a difference between authorising a biography and authorising basically a clapback at tabloid stories. They're not the same thing, and that's what this is. This whole book was supposed to set the record straight, tell their side of the story. So it's a bestseller, it made a lot of money, but what have we actually gained from it in terms of knowledge? I think it's fine to write a biography that's biased and it's from someone's point of view. The difference is when you claim to say something's objective when it's not, it's very subjective. There's also a sense of trying to claim the moral high ground in a lot of areas where there is none. His biases remove all the logic from the situations. There's just an over-inflation of the potential. It's like, could Meghan have been a good addition to the royal family? Yes, she could have been, but she wasn't. This book, like Harry's books there, its main objective seems to be to erase any accountability that Meghan might have as an adult woman who made choices in her adult life. And it's just pointing the finger elsewhere. It's like, all these things are reasons why this went wrong and we shouldn't blame her for it. To recap, with Harry's book, it's a first-hand source, but you have to look at the motivation, his aims, and his intention of writing his book. They aren't for documenting his life in the way that the Dimbleby biography was for Charles. It was about documenting his life, all of his life, as opposed to just the bits that he's unhappy about that he's been seen in a certain light for. We need to be critical and ask questions, again, like with Omid's and Carolyn's book. Is it Carolyn's book? Where is this information coming from? When someone's claiming to have some kind of niche expertise and they have none, it's very important to understand where you're getting the information from. This has been a long video. If you've made it this far, well done. But yeah, this was just the first episode and I was just going to talk about introductions. I am going to be reading more extracts and reviewing other books as well. Yeah, so if you're interested in that, then you can subscribe, I guess. Thank you for watching. Bye.